noite a todos. O meu nome é Zé Pedro Cobra. Foi com muito gosto e muita honra que aceitei este convite para fazer neste evento, nesta conferência pública de Mathieu Ricard, intitulada Felicidade e Altruísmo, esta breve apresentação do evento. Evento organizado pela Fundação Kangyur Rinpoche e pela Songtsen, Casa de Cultura do Tibete. O tema que aqui nos traz hoje, a felicidade, a alegria, dá-me também o mote para começar exatamente por aí, naquilo que a organização pretendeu que fosse um serão cúmplice, na medida do possível, em cerca de 1.300 pessoas, mas em estarmos todos mais próximos uns dos outros. E a primeira história que vos relatava neste mote de apresentação está exatamente relacionada com uma zona em Portugal, porque estamos em Portugal, muito meditativa, que é o Alentejo. Partilhando convosco um episódio que se passou com um indivíduo que foi ter com a vizinha já à tarde, à noite, e pedindo-lhe ao vizinha: desculpe vir aqui. Não se ouve? E assim. Bom, o meu nome é Zé Pedro Cobra. Pronto. Avancemos. Dizia eu que aquele que foi muito... Não está bom? Assim? Assim. Ok. Vou tentar manter o equilíbrio, que é aquilo que nós todos procuramos. Assim está bom? Assim está equilibrado. Muito bem. Portanto, dizia eu que esta primeira história que partilhava convosco, numa noite que se pretende de alegria e de felicidade, é também uma história de humor, porque é com essa alegria e essa felicidade que entramos e que seguramente sairemos ainda melhor. Dizia eu que é uma história passada numa zona muito meditativa para nós portugueses, que é o Alentejo, e onde um indivíduo foi ter com a vizinha, já à noite, dirigindo-se a ela dizendo à vizinha: desculpe lá vir a esta hora que isto já é tarde, mas sabe o que é que foi? Rasgou-se uma borracha de água quente e eu não consigo dormir, tenho os pés todos gelados, não sei se foi com as brasunhas dos pés, dei cabo daquilo, rasguei-lhe aquilo tudo. Eu com os pés frios não durmo. E a senhora diz-lhe: pois olha, borrachas não tenho, mas tenho aqui um gatinho, sempre lhe dá um aconchego aos pés, sabe que esta coisa dos animais é uma coisa importante para a gente. E diz assim: por acaso não tinha pensado nisso, mas olha, tenho cá o gato, que leva o gato. O homem leva o gato no dia a seguir às 5 da manhã, já está a bater ao ferrolho da senhora, com uma vista deitada abaixo, o pijama todo rasgado, o cabelo todo no ar, a segurar o gato pelo rabo, o gato com os pelos todos eriçados. E a senhora perguntou: careta, mas isto não correu bem? Eu disse assim: bem, vamos ver, isto até começou bem. Quando ele abria a boca, o bicho aguentou-se, mas quando despejei a água quente lá para dentro, é que o gajo esparneava por todo lado. Bom, eu começava por esta história só para vos deixar o mote daquilo que eu acho que estamos a viver todos, genericamente, nos dias de hoje. Estamos a viver uma realidade diferente daquela que nós fomos habituados a viver durante muitos anos. Aquilo que estamos a ser impelidos a fazer é uma mudança. É esse o desafio que nos está a caber a todos nós. Hoje em dia já temos gatos e não borrachas de água quente e nós continuamos a lidar com o mundo e com a vida no mesmo sistema económico, no mesmo sistema político, no mesmo sistema social, inclusive, e com valores desajustados para aquilo que objetivamente precisamos. Porque está a doer, como terá doído a noite destes dois animais, como podemos imaginar. Eu diria que aquilo que estamos aqui também todos para fazer é um desafio de disponibilidade para aprender. Fez, dia 8 de março, 100 anos, este ano que nasceu Alberto Queiro, um dos heterónimos de Fernando Pessoa. No seu poema de nascimento, O Guardador de Rebanhos, ele fala-nos exatamente sobre desaprender, sobre desconstruir preconceitos que nós temos assumidos naquela que é a nossa vida e a nossa realidade. É esse desafio que aqui estamos a fazer para aprender também com outros. É nessa perspectiva de outra profundidade, eu diria mesmo em busca de um ser espiritual, e falá-lo com esta frontalidade, porque usando até o título do livro de Luís Portela com o mesmo nome, Ser Espiritual, ter essa abertura para ir um bocadinho mais longe, mais profundo, em busca exatamente de um sentido, e fazê-lo com humildade. Um dos textos recentemente publicados por Mathieu Ricard tem exatamente a ver com esse desafio da humildade, talvez dos maiores desafios que nós temos hoje em dia, essa disponibilidade também para aprender. Como nos dizia Daniel Gilbert, professor norte-americano, psicólogo e professor em Harvard, deixava-nos o desafio no seu livro Stumbling on Happiness, tropeçando na felicidade, onde ele termina com uma solução propondo exatamente a disponibilidade para ouvirmos as experiências emocionais dos outros. Mais do que uma receita, ouvirmos as experiências e o caminho trilhado. E hoje, nós aqui temos o enormíssimo privilégio de poder ouvir uma partilha e experiências fantásticas de Matthieu Ricard. Um homem nascido em 1946, em França, filho de um filósofo e de uma artista, pintora, numa Paris que estava no auge do seu apogeu cultural e filosófico e intelectual. Ele apresenta-se como monge, autor e fotógrafo. Depois de ter concluído em 1972 um doutoramento em Biologia Genética Molecular, voltou ao Tibete, onde tinha começado a sua primeira experiência em 1967, e onde, num trabalho de retiro, de rigor, de dedicação e de empenho nesse caminho, nos traz hoje aqui uma perspectiva diferente sobre felicidade. Mostra-nos também que há um caminho que nos cabe a nós poder trilhar. Indica-nos que é exatamente que depende efetivamente de cada um de nós, esse caminho para a felicidade. Como diria o Ricardo Araújo Pereira, num dos seus sketches, quando fazia de presidente da Junta de São Jorge da Morronhanha, e lhe perguntavam sobre qual é o caminho para a felicidade, e ele respondeu: ora bem, o caminho para a felicidade não lhe sei dizer qual é, mas o que lhe posso garantir é que, se há buracos nesse caminho, são da responsabilidade da anterior autarquia. Há sempre uma forma de não sermos nós a trilhar esse caminho, ou da responsabilidade por esse caminho não ser de cada um. É exatamente esse desafio que hoje vamos ouvir, numa partilha de uma experiência de décadas nesse retiro e nesse trabalho intenso, começado primeiro no Ocidente e depois no Oriente. Eu diria que é exatamente essa ligação entre o Ocidente e o Oriente que caracteriza Matthieu Ricard como orador e como autor, como ele se intitula. Os livros que publicou, o primeiro deles em 1997, O Monge e o Filósofo, são um exemplo disso mesmo. Uma ligação, um livro feito por ele e por seu pai, que foi um dos best-sellers internacionais mais fantásticos nesta aproximação destas duas realidades. É exatamente outra ligação à área da ciência e da meditação que caracterizam a atividade de Matthieu Ricard no Instituto Mind and Life Institute, onde, como voluntário, tem-se colaborado com escritos, com livros, com publicações e mesmo como voluntário em estudos sobre a mente e a influência da meditação neste processo para uma felicidade. Define-se também como fotógrafo, onde é importante reter que as fantásticas fotografias e os muitos livros que tem publicados, numa paixão que tem desde criança, desde os 15 anos, o envolve sobretudo como uma perspectiva de apanhar a beleza da humanidade, do mundo e da natureza. Mesmo em ambientes adversos, mesmo em circunstâncias complicadas e de grandes dificuldades, como aquelas que se enfrentam também na zona dos Altos Himalaias. Eu diria que, para além destas três características, uma outra, que é o mote que deixo no termo desta apresentação, é também claramente um altruísta. Esta apresentação sobre felicidade e altruísmo tem, como ele define no seu último livro, exatamente uma referência do exemplo prático. Em Karuna Shechen, um projeto humanitário iniciado em 2000 e já com muitas iniciativas feitas antes disso, junto com outras instituições, para um apoio humanitário na área da educação, da saúde, dos serviços sociais e do ambiente nessa zona dos Grandes Himalaias, no Butão, no Nepal, no Tibete e no norte da Índia. Esses são exemplos concretos de um trabalho notável feito com uma experiência que mais de 20 anos. E fala-nos de um altruísmo que ele próprio qualifica e que nos transmitirá como um altruísmo verdadeiro. Não é aquele altruísmo de dizer que ele é bonzinho. É um tipo que fez qualquer coisa por outro. Nós muitas vezes fazemos e parece que estamos à espera de um retorno. Até nas coisas simples como no trânsito. Deixamos passar um carro, faz favor, mas logo a seguir a dizer: não agradeças ao boi, não é preciso. Logo, não é? É desprendido disso tudo. É nessa incondicionalidade que abraçamos este trajeto e que abraça este projeto. Ele não só nos fala de um altruísmo verdadeiro, como nos diz que ele está na nossa essência. E mais do que isso, iremos ouvir e nos explicará que é, na sua perspectiva, inevitável para a nossa sobrevivência. Eu termino com uma citação também de outro francês, nascido em 1912, Abbé Pierre, um grande religioso, um homem a pensar o mundo e a pensar França, e que disse, num livro também publicado em Portugal, que não sei se o século XXI será um século religioso, mas será seguramente um século fraterno ou fracassará. E que nos cabe a cada um de nós, independentemente da sua fé ou do seu pensamento, tornar essa ideia uma realidade. Cabe-nos agora começar aqui, a cada um de nós individualmente, com esta abertura e a oportunidade fantástica de ouvirmos esta partilha, que saibamos nós ter a mesma vontade para escutar e a mesma capacidade para aprender que Mathieu Ricard tem para apresentar e para nos ensinar. Peço a todos um muito português, porque caloroso, aplauso para o autor, monge e fotógrafo Mathieu Ricard. Muito obrigado.
So, thank you very much for your kind words. So I'm here to share with you some thoughts and also to serve. The purpose of my coming being to support the wonderful work of CASA, who takes care of homeless, of the Kangyo Rinpoche Foundation, that perpetuates the spiritual heritage of Tibet and the Himalayas, and to serve my teachers, Wangyal Rinpoche and Jimmy Kes Rinpoche, who kindly suggested that I may say a few crazy words and share it with you. And also, of course, the wonderful work of trying to save some animals which have been thrown in the streets. So with that spirit of serving that I'm with you today, and I think we spoke of brotherhood and sisterhood, and it's quite clear, I think, that if we want to continue this adventure on this planet, we really need to go to a higher level of cooperation. But there is a good news about that, is that it turns out that cooperation has been much more creative throughout the process of evolution than competition. A lot has been said about competition, the struggle for life, the survival of the fittest, and all those things. But if you read correctly Darwin, he speaks much more of cooperation, of social animals, of how even there's a wonderful quote where it says that sympathy, that's the word he uses for compassion, for altruism. Altruism word was not used yet in this time. He says sympathy is something that is vital to the fabric of a society, and he said even through teaching and to sharing, this notion of sympathy should extend beyond the restricted cycle of our kins, and he said even to other species. So of course we are very far at the time of Darwin of the notion of selfish genes and things like that. Well, in the recent years, the notion of that cooperation, if you look at evolution, has been much more creative in achieving higher degrees of complexity, and is crucial to what our society, and even more now when we are facing challenges. So there's a wonderful book by Martin Nowak called Super Cooperators. So we are super cooperators, but we need now to be super cooperators. So why after this is not in the Himalaya, by the way. So why after the Himalayan photos, which you saw before, why this man at the edge of a precipice? So the image here represent the kind of urgent challenges that we are facing today. There are many such challenges. And those challenges is not just, many of them are not just sort of temporary annoyance or little problem that slow us down. There are challenges that may lead to tipping points. What is a tipping point? Well, imagine that this man is just walking 5 steps in that direction. Big change. Something will happen. Now remember, I think one of the presidents, I won't say who, is not here. He said, 5 years ago, we were at the edge of the precipice, and now we made a big step forward. So that's the risk we have now. Being obsessed by constant increased use of resources, of unsustainable growth, is to make a big step forward in the abyss of basically devastation. So, but this is not the only challenge. We are facing multiple challenges, but of course a challenge can be transformed into opportunity. So what are the challenges? One of the main ones, which I've seen throughout the world, is that it is very hard to reconcile 3 time scale and 3 kinds of people, thinkers and actors in society who are speaking 3 different languages because of those 3 time scales. You have first the classical economics that basically thinks very short term, maximum 5 years, but sometimes you go down to doing 400 million transactions per second, so very, very fast. So the balance sheet at the end of the year, the up and down of the stock market in the week, very short term, but they still insist that this is reality, and instead of economy being at the service of society, that somehow society should serve the purpose of economics, otherwise everything was going to fail, which of course is not the way it actually works. But now, if you take those kind of short-term-minded economists with someone who is a great scientist on the environment and knows what's going to happen in 30, 50, 100 years, they don't speak the same language, so it's very frustrating. So, in the between, then you have the midterm. You have flourishing, human flourishing, 10 years, 20 years, a career, a generation, a lifetime. How do you perceive your life day to day? What is the quality of every moment that passes by? And what is also, how do you have a bigger picture of the 10 years that have gone and what you can see as a possibility if you survive for the 10 years ahead? So that's the midterm. And again, people who speak of human flourishing, of the quality of social life, again, it's not the same language as economists and possibly of the environmentalists. So there's a disconnect that makes a very incoherent discourse when it comes to take decisions, to have policies, and to see the future of what we do. And then people say, well, we need a conceptual framework to work all that together and somehow have some foundation for a common language. So think carefully, and is there any other concept? And if anyone has some idea, please raise your hand and let me know. Because I really, having met with many economists, discussed with them, hundreds of environmentalists, a lot of scientists, psychologists, friends, I'm now really convinced that there's only one concept that works. And that concept is altruism. It's a simple one. And altruism means having consideration for the situation of others, having a benevolent attitude that you care, you value others, you care for others. If others is just doing okay, you wish that that person might be happy and happier. If that person is facing difficulty or suffering, You wish that the cause of suffering and the suffering may be dispelled. So that's your motivation, that's your goal, that's altruism. Now you can see that's not just a kind of naive, ideal, some kind of utopia. It's a very pragmatic approach to dealing with those 3 time scale. If you have more consideration for others, then naturally you will tend toward a more caring economics. You will not play like at the casino with the resources that, or the savings that people have entrusted you with just for the sake of having a bigger bonus or simply because you are a reckless free rider and you want to use the system to become as rich as possible and you don't care a damn about the people. So that's a lack of consideration for others. So caring economics, and we'll come back to what it means, but caring economics does things that the classic economics of maximizing your personal interests and preferences can never do. And there's 2 things that this classic economics can never do. One is taking care of common goods, quality of the atmosphere, quality of the ocean, of the biodiversity. Why should a selfish person care? And then second, it cannot address poverty in the midst of plenty, because actually they need to keep poverty as it is. I just met Manfred Max Neff, a Chilean economist who worked for the UN and who is one of the leading economists working with ecology. And he said they need to maintain the poor people so that poor girls in Bangladesh make cheap clothes for us. So there is no way that it will remedy to poverty if you just want to maximize your personal interest. So you need caring economics. Then what does care or altruism do in the midterm? Well, you will do what's necessary with consideration for others to improve the fabric of social life, the quality of human relation. You will remedy to inequalities. You will favor what the Bhutanese have called gross national happiness, which is not just happiness now, but it also includes social wealth, environmental wealth, some financial wealth, but it's an extended well-being that also keeps in consideration future generations. So that's where we come then, that the fact that having more consideration for others is also the complete prerequisite to have a reasonable behavior, having in mind the fate of future generations. Environment is a very complex scientific, economical, political issue, but in the end, it comes to a question of altruism versus selfishness. Why? Because if you don't care about future generations, then there's no point worrying about the environment. You just do what you like and they will see. So, you know, the famous American comic, Groucho Marx. By the way, I'm Marxist, but the Groucho tendency. So he said, why should I care for future generations? What did they do for me? Well, I heard this was a joke, but many people are saying the same thing, unfortunately, not as a joke. Stephen Forbes, you know, Forbes magazines, one of the American billionaires, I heard him and I went back and wrote down exactly his words. Someone on Fox News, maybe you heard of Fox News, asking him about the raise of the ocean, you know, which is very regular, very linear, unavoidable, that's it. So he said, in reply to that, I find absurd to change my behavior now for something that will happen after 100 years. So where is the absurdity? I'll let you decide. The future generation, they will say, you knew, and yet you did nothing. So that's the dilemma. That's a question of selfishness versus altruism. So, therefore, we need to take that in consideration. We cannot just ignore that. And if we have this consideration for others, then the economists now, the caring economists, can talk with people looking after gross national happiness, that's the midterm, and they can talk with environmentalists who take care of our children, grandchildren, and further generation. Why is the environment such a challenge? Because economics, of course, we know, we have hand-on, our life we can manage, but the change in the environment and the fact that we have a major impact on the planet, we didn't mean to do that. It was not in our intention. Now, if you cheat someone, you know what you are doing. But if you neglect the environment, what happens today somehow was not decided with a bad intention. It just happened because we were taken by surprise by the increase of the population, the Industrial Revolution, and until 300 years ago, the Earth was so resilient that no matter what we could do, somehow the Earth will repair that. Now it's not the case. Now we have entered the Anthropocene since the great acceleration of 1950, where man has is the major impact on the planet. So how does that look? So please keep in mind this limit. And you can say that if you walk within this, you are within the limits of the boundaries of safety. That means you can still prosper. If you go over that, now, of course, you know what's happened, but even you are in the dark and you sort of walk here and you hear the noise, you don't see this limit, but you hear and you know it cannot be so far. So you don't know exactly where it is, but you say, okay, now I know it's getting close. By all means, I must slow down. This is no more safe to just keep on walking in that direction. So that's what the scientists have called planet boundaries. And there was a group of 30 scientists or so, including a Nobel Prize, led by Johan Rockström of the Earth Resilience Center in Stockholm, who published a famous paper defining a number of parameters, which I'm not going to read, but you can see this includes climate change, biodiversity loss, how much agricultural land we use. Now, basically, 30% of all usable land is for livestock and agriculture. So, within these limits, we are safe to continue to prosper for 150,000 years. Why are we prosperous now? Because 12,000 years ago, we entered the Holocene, which is a very remarkably stable climate period. That was the beginning of agriculture. Before that, there was too much climate change. It was glaciation and warming up and glaciation again, and agriculture could not prosper. It was just hunter-gatherers. Now we have an exceptional period of stability that gave rise to what we call now human civilization. So in 1900, you could see that we were very much completely in safe areas. Now 1950 starts getting a little bit hotter. As you can see, climate change is coming near to the limit of danger, how much we use land for agriculture also, nitrogen flow, that's the use of pesticides and fertilizers, and how the nitrogen goes in the water and in the soil. So anyway, it starts getting worrying, but not that much, right? Now hold your breath, not very long, just for the time to go to the next slide and imagine what is going to be. So did you imagine that? So that's the situation in 2010, so it's got worse even now. So just to give you one example of how far we have gone beyond the limit of safety is at the current speed of disappearance of species on Earth, animal species. 30% of all species will have disappeared for good, forever, by 2050. That is not only, the Siberian tiger, the unicorn rhinoceros of Java, it's thousands and thousands of insects, small mammals, batracians, reptiles, fishes. 90% of all fishes have gone already from the oceans within this century, last century. So this is something that is not reversible. You can keep a lot of DNAs in the fridge, useless. It's never going to come back. So there are many of such things. That's a tipping point, irreversible change. And that could be the same with climate change and many others of those. So there's a real danger. And this is something that, when climatologists, when they used to go to Washington 20 years ago and say, something really bad is going to happen in 50 years, the answer was come back in 49 years. But when it's 49 years, it's too late. The Stern report on the cost of what will be this catastrophe is that it will cost 20 times more there to humanity than to do something now. When there's 200 million refugees, you won't stop them. Lampedusa, Gibraltar, all that, there will be an enormous influx of refugees. If half of Bangladesh is underwater, Indian borders will not stop those 20 or 30 millions of people who just want to survive. So this is a real problem. This is a glacier in Bhutan. The third pole, the Himalaya, 2,000 big and small glaciers are melting faster than the Arctic because they get some dust from China and India on the snow, and it catches more light and it melts faster. This is a glacier in Austria in 1875. Look what's left now. I was just in Iceland, where there is the largest glacier in Europe. They all say in 50 years it's gone, nothing left. So now people say, well, again, we will see, we'll adapt. If an atomic bomb falls on France, we'll adapt somehow. Some survivors will be there, they'll manage something, but at what cost? What kind of suffering? So here's these two very strange maps, right? So what are they? The top one is the surface of the countries with an indexed by their CO2 emission. So as you can see, America becomes very bloated, and so is Europe, becomes inflated like a balloon. And you see Africa is almost gone from the map. Because why? Because Americans emit 200 times more CO2 per capita than Tanzanians. A Qatari emits 2,000 times more CO2 than an Afghan. So they are the ones who emit CO2 that cause global warming. Now, what is the map below is the number of deaths today due to extreme of climates, increase of some temperature-sensitive disease like malaria. There are 15 diseases which are temperature-sensitive. And, overflow of rivers or drought or rise of the ocean. So now you see Africa is bloated like anything, and those who were the culprits, they almost disappear from the map. Nobody dies because of climate change in North Hemisphere, basically. They just put the aircon or they put the heater and they don't care. So now, these are the distribution of those deaths in 1 year, just clearly due to this climate issue. So this all came from 1950, from this exponential growth of many things, atmospheric carbon dioxide, loss of rainforest, loss of biodiversity, fishery exploitation, which is like mad, basically, endless, how much fertilizers. So welcome to the Anthropocene. So we sort of make a big mess, now we have the major impact on the planet. So we cannot say, oh, it's not our fault. No, and something will happen. It's not. We are responsible. We should assume that, and that's why altruism is necessary, because selfishness will not do the job. So now, there's one thing I left, because it's an interesting case, is the methane. Methane is 20 times more active to create greenhouse gas effect, and it all comes from livestock, raising livestock. You know, by the way, you may not be aware, but on the earth, we raise in an industrial way and kill 60 billion land animals every year. And we also kill, by the way, 1,000 million billion, that's with 1 trillion sea animal. So that has a huge impact. It's the different things related with livestock industry, you know, the cows and veals and all that, the different gas, the dejection from the pigs, all that create methane. And that's one of the second cause of global warming after housing, private, industrial, public, and before transportation. Now it has been estimated, according to the last IPCC report released in March, April, last month, it's about 15% of all is due to livestock and what the grain that we need for the livestock. So that's major problem. It's also a social problem, social injustice. Why? Because 775 million tons of grain, that means wheat and corn and soy, are produced in the South countries like South America and Africa in order to be sent to raise livestock in the US and other places to produce meat. So that could be used to feed those countries, but they are used to make meat, which is mostly used by rich countries. Is that true? Look at the consumption of meat per head per year. United States is about 130 kilo per person per year. In France it's 80, and in India it's 3.5. So you see the big, huge discrepancy. So there is this thing. First, the animals are the first victim. Second, the poor are the first victim. And then it's not even good for the rich, because there was a study, many studies, but one was done at Harvard on 100,000 patients followed over 20 years. And it showed that people who eat red meat 5 times a week have about increased mortality from cancer and heart disease that is 15% higher. So it's good for nobody. Everybody loses. So that's why the IPCC report said one of the quickest and easiest and most effective way to mitigate climate change would be to drastically reduce meat consumption, because we cannot go on like that. Otherwise, meat production will still double by 2050. This is totally unsustainable. So the best way is to follow George Bernard Shaw's advice, which I try to follow. Animals are my friend, and I don't eat my friend. But if you can't do that, at least please eat them a little less. So now, is it because we are so selfish? Oh, many people think that. Man is a wool for man. It was plotted and was taken back by Hobbes and many people. They say, human beings, terrible, bad nature. If you leave them alone, they'll start killing each other, hopeless. Well, it doesn't look too bad. Then came Freud, who said, I've discovered little good in humans. From what I know, most of them are rascals. Good news. So we should know we're all rascals. But not everyone seems to be rascals. I mean, there's plenty of wonderful people in this earth. So what to do? Are we that much selfish? Well, there are certainly in daily life so many expressions of kindness, of dedication. You know, this man, he doesn't look only kind. He lost his leg when he was 5 years old. Since then, he has been dedicating all his life to help others, the sick and the destitute. Here he's actually feeding his own father. And there is cooperation. You know, if 100 people cooperate like that, it's not in the news. If 2 of them fight, sure, it's in the news. You know, tonight we are peacefully gathered together. When you come out, are you going to say, wow, that's so nice, nobody has a fight in this room? No, we think it's normal. That means we sort of ignore the banality of goodness, because that's the way we expect things to be, and that's the way actually it is most of the time. If 2 people fight somewhere, I say, well, we went to a conference on altruism and these 2 people were banging each other on the nose. So we'll be shocked and we'll speak about it. So what is deviant is calling for us for our attention. But in Bhutan, when for instance, like here in the US, when people in a village build a house, everybody comes. And then next year, if you house, they'll all come. And there's a great joy in cooperating. It's much more fun than being selfish in one's corner. And there's not only human beings who cooperate. And this is not a trick, this is a real photo. Then, of course, there's a struggle for life. The survival of the fittest. There's one loser and one winner. And that's happened too. Oh, but it's not, the whole thing is not about that. So, in fact, the quality of our life is intimately related to the quality of human relation. And even statisticians of the OCDE, when they try to see 12 things in Europe or in the OCDE countries which matter most for happiness, the number 1 that came is quality of human relationship, not income. That was, I think, something like number 8 in the list. And that's not only human again. And then here you have 200-year-old Japanese woman in a place in northern Japan where there is the highest number of centenarians in the world. So some sociologist and a movie maker who made a movie called Happy, is one of my friends, went there and they said, why? And they found out that what the people say there is, well, we are together from birth, throughout life, and until death, we're always together. Grandmothers and surviving grandfathers, they sort of get together, you can see them singing and dancing even they're 95, and at the end of when the school children come out, they wait for them and they hug them and everybody is together. So that's one of the things. And it has been shown that a quality social support, not just knowing many people, but people on whom you can count, people that you can seek for advice, for solace, for consolation. If you have that, it's increased mental health, increased longevity, a stronger immune system, less heart disease, less substance abuse like tobacco and alcohol and others, and less dementia. So very important to have social support. Now, fine. So let's come back to the idea. Does true altruism exist or not? Because if it doesn't, then all what I say is useless. There's no point teaching, kindness, cooperative behavior in schools, because if we are all dead selfish, it's not going to work. It will be waterproof. So many philosophers and even psychologists until 1950s said, yes, scratch at the surface of an altruist and the selfish will bleed. Means beneath the surface, it's always something really selfish. Even you do something nice to others, you're just calculating what you can expect in return, etc., etc. So this was a paradigm for a long time. There has never been any science of all kinds to substantiate this claim. Nothing. It was just an idea. Man is selfish. Full stop. And you can explain always, Of course, if you look and if you make your imagination work very hard, you can always imagine a selfish motive. But then when psychologists try to actually see, like someone like Daniel Batson, for 30 years with his team, they put people in many different situations, complex situations, and they found that no, there's a significant percentage of people who, no matter what, will behave in a cooperative and altruistic way. So you cannot prove that definitely altruism is there, but you can disprove the fact that we are universally selfish. It's not the case. That's good news. But you know, those people are quite smart. They still think that they can show that we are selfish. For instance, if I do something nice, like our friend here do for CASA, helping the homeless, saving animals from the street, and when they come back, they say, oh, I feel so good. I've been helping those people. Oh, they almost bring me as much to me that I bring to them. Oh, but you are selfish. You do that because you feel good. Oh, that's all. It's the warm glow, And you hear people saying that. But is it really true? Or is it just that the fact to be good feels good? And if you thought with a very selfish motivation, oh, I heard, if you take care of people, you feel good. I don't care about people, but I'll try to help someone so that I feel good. It won't work. Because it's not just doing something, it's the actual good heart that makes you also feel good. But also, you can disprove that in many ways. That's the only reason. For instance, there was someone on the subway in New York, and a father with 2 girls, and then someone fell at epileptic fit. So then he helped, the person got up, and then walked and fell on the track. Then the train is coming. So this man with his 2 little girls, he saw the man is going to be killed. But he saw there was some space. If the man was like that or sitting, would lie down. So he jumped and lay down with him, and they just passed under. Do you think this man thought, I'm going to feel so good when this is over? Of course not. But then all the press came and interviewed, said, oh, why you did that? You're so brave. And he said, but of course, I knew it could be done. I jumped. I had no choice. It was obvious. Hey, said the selfish, universal selfish psychologist, you said you had no choice. That means you were like a robot. Automatic behavior. This is not altruistic motivation that defines altruism. If you just don't think and jump, well, it's altruistic there. You could not help, you just jump. So of course that doesn't make sense. I talked with Daniel Batson many times, and he said, this is silly. It just means that when it is obvious, you don't have to think for so long. And if you have good nature, if you see that, you don't think for half an hour like this man. You think he's thinking for half an hour, should I give my hand, not give my hand, should I give it? So he gives his hand, but you think he had no choice? Of course he had a choice. If that was his worst enemy in a time of genocide or something, he would let his enemy drown with great happiness. So he had the choice. But the choice is obvious. It just takes like this because it's so clear. So he had a choice, of course. But then, if you still think, well, who knows? First of all, animals do that as well. So cute. Well, he had a choice also. He could have let it go, no? This one, he has a choice. Okay. But here is something else. Here is the pastor, André Trocmé, and his wife, Magda. There was a village in France called Chambon-sur-Lignon during the Second World War. Under the inspiration of this pastor, who was very kind, of course, and his wife as well, the whole village decided that, because many, first from the Spain Civil War, then all the Jewish families, somehow it was a mountain in Haute-Loire near Switzerland, not far from Switzerland, so many people tried to come there, to flee, to escape. So they were hiding them, bringing them to Switzerland, and then the Gestapo, the Vichy government tried to threaten them. They arrested him for a while, they threatened to kill him. They never said, they said, yes, occasionally we do. Actually, they did a lot. They saved 3,000 Jews during the Second World War. But we will do it no matter what. No need to tell us. We will do it. So they did it. And it did it over many years. There was a great danger for themselves and their families. They could think for the long term. They all got together. So you cannot find much selfish motivation in that. So best is not to continue to just have this very cynical attitude. But I would like to read this quote because I think it really captures what genuine altruism is, and we should be confident that it exists. So this is someone who belongs to those who give award to those who rescued Jewish families during the Second World War in Israel. He said, goodness leaves us gasping. That means so surprised. For we refuse to recognize it as a natural human attribute. So off we go on the long search for some hidden motivation, some extraordinary explanation for such peculiar behavior. Instead of attempting to distance ourselves politely from them, while at the same time lauding, praising their deeds, would it not be better to rediscover the altruistic potential within us? Let's not search for mysterious explanation of goodness in others, but rather rediscover the mystery of goodness in ourselves. So that goodness expresses itself in many ways. It could be through empathy, through compassion, to loving kindness, to maternal care. So this is, for instance, one of the patients that we saved in Tibet. She was having a bone TB. She was in a tent with a 13-year-old daughter, no other family. She was going to die. So we help her. So you see, when you see someone like that, you have a feeling of empathy. So what empathy is there's two kinds, but one is the affective resonance. If you look smiling, happy, I will feel happy by affect emotional resonance. If you suffer, I will suffer because of your suffering. So my suffering is real. It's not the same as yours, but it's triggered by yours. Another aspect is cognitive empathy. Is either I try to imagine what you feel, even I don't feel it, or I try to imagine what I would feel if I was you, which is slightly different. Now, empathy, just on its own, is a very important element because it tells us how others are feeling. And if we don't know that, if we don't perceive that, then why should we care? No psychopath have no empathy. They can cut people in pieces. They don't feel anything. They don't care. But if we say, oh, this person is suffering, then we do something. But empathy alone is also risky. You can go to empathic distress, and that's happened so often in medical care, in social work. 60% of all medical personnel in the US have suffered or will suffer of burnout once in their life or more. That means emotional exhaustion, empathy fatigue. So why does that happen? Because just leaving empathy on its own is like an electric pump without water. It burns. So what is the water that is missing? It is altruistic love. It is this human warmth that a doctor or a nurse will give to the patient. And there is no compassion fatigue. So you may say it's a bold claim, but here comes the science. I've been working with neuroscientists for last 13 years, and one of them is Tanya Singer. She works at the Max Planck Institute of Leipzig, and she's one of the world specialists on empathy. So because we have been doing those through the Mind and Life Institute, we have been doing those collaboration with psychologists, scientists, clinicians. So I met her and said, okay, I'm happy, I'm very interested in that topic, so I will come to your lab. So we explored that, and since then we have become friends and collaborators. So first she said, okay, go in the MRI machine and please meditate on whatever you do, compassion, altruism. So I did, and that was just the sort of beginning, so we're just testing. So I had some earphones in the MRI, and this time we were using a technique called real-time fMRI. So we can see within a few seconds which area of the brain are activated, which normally takes many days of analysis to find out. So then she said, after a while, she said, what are you doing? It's not what we see with empathy normally. She has been studying that for 20 years. I said, well, I'm meditating on compassion. She said, what's that, basically? Come out of the machine. So we come out of the machine and we start talking, and I describe, and she said, but can't you try to just meditate on empathy and nothing else? I said, well, I can try. So I had seen a very terrible documentary on the BBC about Romanian children in sort of disabilitated children's home, where they were so fragile, so much suffering, they were so feeble that their bones will break sometime when they were walking around. They were basically feeding them, washing them, and that's all. A terrible condition. So, and then I was coming from Tibet, where there had been an area with an earthquake, and all those dramas were in my mind. So for 1.5 hours, alternating 1 minute of rest, 90 seconds of empathy, I would just resonate with suffering, resonate with suffering, resonate with suffering. And she said, don't bring back your compassion, okay? So I tried to stop the compassion. When I said that to the Dalai Lama, I said, how can you stop compassion? Well, I said, well, I don't know, but I just focus on suffering and suffering and suffering and nothing else. So then after 1 hour, I was a complete burnout. I could not, it was just overwhelming. I was feeling distressed. I didn't know what to do with those suffering, powerless, distressed. I could not stand it anymore. So then we were supposed to do the compassion, to compare. And it was 11:30 in the morning. I've been already more than 1.5 hours in the MRI. And Tanya said, well, we could have a lunch break. I said, no. This is too much. I have to get rid of that somehow. So let's continue. So then I moved to the loving kindness, compassion, caring meditation. And then it's completely different. It's like every atom of suffering filled with an atom of love. It's like mentally embracing those children. And then in the brain, so different also. The areas of distress, like the amygdala was turned off. Areas to do with maternal love, with feeling of affiliation were turned on. Completely different picture. So we came with the idea that, doctors sometimes speak of compassion fatigue, that there was no compassion fatigue. This you could give as much as you want because it's a constructive feeling. But there was an empathy fatigue, and we actually just published a paper showing that empathy and compassion are very different networks in the brain. So that's, now Tanya is doing a study with 300 volunteers financed by the European Commission, novices, to distinguish affective, cognitive, empathy, loving kindness, compassion, and there's a wonderful 1-year program, and the results are extremely good already, and the idea is to bring in the medical world a remedy to burnout by training compassion, which of course is not part of the curriculum. It seems very strange, but this is the heart of helping others, and in the medical profession, you teach many things, but you don't teach how to cultivate compassion. So this is just to tell you how thinking, practicing meditation, and working with neuroscientists and psychologists and caregivers, the whole thing together can really be a service to society, and that's what the Dalai Lama always says about Mind and Life. Please think what we can contribute to society. So consolation is part of that, and not only in humans. And then it came through evolution to maternal love, and then we can extend that to others, not only to our kins, It's also happened in animals, so it's going too fast. So this is a tigress in Calcutta Zoo. Adopted some little pigs that had no mother. Seems to be going very well. And then, okay, now comes just a sort of new idea. Okay, altruism exists, great, but look at society. Inequalities, people complain, all kinds of things. So if it's just that altruism exists, it doesn't help so much, right? We need to enhance it. We need to go to that next step of cooperation, of consideration for others, of caring. Otherwise, we are not going to move to a caring economics and so forth. So how to enhance altruism? Well, there are two ways. One has to start with the nucleus of people, with the strength of idea, people who get together, and even they are like 10, 20%, you can have a tipping point in the culture, and then the other people go through imitation, because that's a very strong instinct in adopting a new culture. If something seems that now you cannot say it's okay according to your values, then you change side. For instance, at the time of abolition of slavery in UK, it started with 10 people who were dedicated to that, and everybody thought they were complete lunatics, and they're completely unrealistic, and economically it will be impossible to get rid of slavery. It took just a few years for them to gain more sympathy and to come to the point where people thought, well, if I say I still get in favor of slavery, no, it just doesn't work with what I think is moral. So then there was a change of culture and slavery was abolished. So this is how we can change things. And culture and individual are mutually sort of shaping each other like the two blades of a knife. So now we should start with individual change. Or is it possible? So this is Kangyo Rinpoche, my first teacher, who also, the Kangyo Rinpoche Foundation, which is here, is dedicated to his memory and to his activities. And Khyentse Rinpoche, another great teacher. So those meditators who went to the lab to see if mind training changed the brain were disciples of those great masters and of the Dalai Lama and others. So how that happened, the Dalai Lama inspired. This is Richard Davidson, one of the great scientists I've been working a lot with in Madison, Wisconsin. This is one of the Mind and Life meeting in Dharamsala on neuroplasticity, how the brain can change. And so then we inspired meditators to go to the lab, measure their brain activity with EEG, electroencephalogram, when they engage in compassion meditation, in focused attention meditation, in open presence meditation, and so forth. Every different type of meditation or mind training has a different signature in the brain. There's no such thing as meditation at large. Meditation means mind training. It all depends what you train. If it happens to be compassion, it's a different area of the brain that will be activated. The other one is the MRI machine. This is Mingyur Rinpoche. Some of you might have read his book in English called The Joy of Living. And he said that MRI machine has 4 characteristics. It is cold, it is narrow, it is dark, and it is noisy. And you have to lie down completely flat, which if you have 12 hours jet lag coming from India, then basically you fall asleep. But still, it worked. This is the first time I went to Madison in year 2001, and I spent 2.5 hours in MRI machine and just coming out of it. So Richard Davidson is very happy that the meditator survived. Now, just briefly, I'm not going to insist on that, but some of the results were remarkable with long-term meditators. Here is a group of novices. The pink line is when they are at rest, they don't do anything. If you ask them to meditate on compassion, nothing happened either. Now, if you do that with experienced meditators, this is a group of 15 went there. Then at rest, of course, they are resting, but when they engage in compassion meditation, there's a huge surge in the gamma frequency or brain oscillation, especially in areas connected with positive emotion. If you look at their brain imaging, here are long-term practitioners at rest. When they engage in compassion meditation, there's a huge increase in some areas of the brain connected with again, maternal love, affiliation, positive affect, etc. In novices, at rest, there is nothing. When they meditate, there is nothing. That's normal. They have not trained what to do. You don't become a pianist without playing the piano, so it doesn't work. Now, that's fine, but those people were like, 50,000 hours of meditation. That's a lot. So what happens if you do it for 4 weeks? 20 minutes a day of mindfulness meditation. Then not only you see a functional change in the brain, what we saw before, but you already see a structural change in the brain. There's an increased volume and density in the gray matter of an area called the hippocampus, which deal with novelty. When you do something new every day, like juggling or playing chess. But here is compassion, or mindfulness, sorry. You see that area has increased compared to a control group. So even 4 weeks, your brain already changed physically, and of course functionally as well. Now, just 2 weeks, 20 minutes a day of compassion meditation increase your pro-social behavior. That means how much you will be open to others, have good relation with others, less conflict, and so forth. And your behavior of helping, actually, it was also measured compared to another psychological intervention. And then, even after 2 weeks, you could see a shrinking of an area called the amygdala that has to do with aggressivity, fear, and anger for this group. So that shows even short training already makes a difference. But that's good news. But now the next step was to do it with 4 or 5 years old preschoolers. That seems to be a bit audacious. It was an 8-week program, 3 days a week, each day 30 minutes, not much, with good instructor. First teaching them mindfulness, breathing. They lie down, there's a teddy bear or a stone, and they're mindful of their breath. Then teaching them kindness, gratitude, all kinds of things. There's a 100-page manual for the instructor. Very simple for 4 or 5 years old. And people say, how is it going to work? Just half an hour, 3 times a week, 4 or 5 years old. You're wasting your time. Well, after 8 weeks, the teacher was asked to evaluate the prosocial behavior of the children in that group compared to another group of children where there was no intervention. As you can see, there's a clear difference. But here comes the ultimate test. That's called the Stickers test, and that cannot lie. This is the ultimate science. So what do you do? Before the intervention, for each child, you find out who is their best friend in the class and their less favorite child in the class, okay? And you give them 4 envelopes, one with a photo of their best friend, one the child that she doesn't like, a stranger, and a sick child. And then you ask them, here is 50 stickers, put them in the envelope. You have to give them away to whoever you like. As you can guess, before the intervention, they give everything almost to their best friend. You think there will be a difference after 8 weeks? People thought maybe, who knows, little bit. Well, it's not a little bit. As you can see here, they give basically the same amount of sticker to their best friend and to their less favorite child. You have leveled down discrimination, out group, in group, those I like a lot, those I don't like. They just give equally to all. Just such a simple intervention with 4, 5 years old. That shows how important it is to begin this kind of training very early of openness, of kindness, of gratitude, and not just teach to the kids to read and write and do maths. So we do that in our school in India. Through Karuna, we now have 20,000 kids in the school that we built. So we do yoga classes, meditation, and first thing the teacher notice is there's a better presence in the class. More kids come. just miss class. So, what to do with all that? So I spoke in the beginning of the short-term, economics, mid-term, quality of life, long-term environment. So in terms of economics, as I mentioned, we need caring economics. I have a friend called Dennis Snower. He founded the Global Economic Symposium, and now he speaks all the time about caring economics. That's the only way to go. The Homo economicus is dead. Now we need the Homo altericus. That's the only way to survive. And it's kind of a caricature of human beings to tell you we're only selfish. This is just not true. So if an economic system is based on something that is not attuned to reality, no wonder it's dysfunctional. So we need this notion of caring economics. Then for the midterm, we need the notion of gross national happiness, because if a country is the richest and the most powerful and everybody is unhappy, what's the use? There's no point. So then, for the long term, what we need is sustainable harmony, not even sustainable growth, because growth, forget about that term, at least in quantitative. There's no way we can continue growing, no matter what people say, grow, 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 consume, consume. We need 3 planets by 2050. Where are you going to find those 3 planets? If today, as the Chinese aspire to have as many cars as Americans, if they had as many cars per head than North America, they will need the whole reserve of oil every year only for themselves. It's not impossible. It is not possible. So a sustainable harmony is a qualitative growth. Forget about quantitative growth. Look at the brain. The brain cannot grow in size. It is constrained by the skull. But it can grow in complexity, connectivity, quality, not in quantity. So this is what we need to do. Then we also need harmony, means also remedying to inequalities. There's 1.5 billion people under the poverty line. This is immoral, and also this is dysfunctional, because inequality means when they are large in a country, and Portugal, unfortunately, has one of the largest inequality in Europe, it's not good for health, it's not good for education, it's good for nothing, basically. Scandinavian countries do much better. They have the smallest inequality throughout the world. So we need this sustainable harmony where we have a more voluntary simplicity, not the completely frantic consumerism. We know how to find happiness in intrinsic values, not just going to the supermarket to buy more stuff if we are depressed. And there's a study by my friend Tim Kasser on consumerism, and he looked for 20 years at 10,000 people, and those with the highest consumerism mind, he found that they are less happy, their health is not as good, they have less real friends, they are more obsessed with debt, they don't care for holistic things like environment. So he says, no, I'm not a moralist, but if you want to be happy, healthy, to have good friends, and to be concerned by the world, you should know that it is not by just buying more, having an outside image, of having the best car, the best house, this and that you are going to find those. It is more in quality of intrinsic value, like friendship, social relations. Just finding happiness within yourself, not just like thinking that the universe is like a mail order catalog for your fancies and desires. It's not going to work. But if you find a sense of contentment, sense of inner peace, sense of compassion, sense of friendship, sense of feeling of common humanity, then you have the inner resources to deal with the ups and downs of life. And if you don't feel so vulnerable, then you're more open to others. So it's the twofold accomplishment of others and your own happiness. If you look for selfish happiness, it doesn't work at all. You, me, all the time is so narrow. A friend of mine who is a handicapped philosopher called Alexandre Jolien, is wonderful. He says, within the bubble of the ego, it smells very stuffy, when you no air. Very stuffy, very uncomfortable. Me, all the time. What happens to me? How are they going to say? Why did they say that? Oh, it's life is miserable, and you make life miserable to others. And you think that you are this small entity while we're all interconnected. So selfish happiness does not work. Now, why altruistic happiness works? First, because as the neuroscientists and positive psychologists like Barbara Fredrickson, she says love is the supreme of all emotion. It's the one that widens your mind, gives you the most satisfaction for you and for others, of course, because that's the goal. So then, it's also attuned to reality. Altruistic love and compassion recognize that we're all interconnected, instead of thinking you are small units sort of interacting on each other. So it's going to work. So from all sides, the pursuit of altruistic well-being is the best way to go for us and for others. So there is hope. It all depends on us to cultivate it, to bring it to society. There's also other indication that maybe it's not as bad as it looks. One of them is the decline of violence. Now people say, oh, violence increasing, look at this. You know, in France, they all speaking of Marseille and the Kalashnikov that you can buy in the supermarket and all that. Well, in 1350, in Oxford, there was 100 homicides, murders, every year for 100,000 inhabitants. Today is 0.6. We have never been in a safer world. This is the rate of homicide in Europe. You see different countries. Sorry, Portugal is not here. It must exist. It went, you know, this is a logarithmic scale, 110, 1, and 0.1. It's a dramatic decrease, between 50 to 100 times less over a few centuries. Only in Sicily, it's 12. I don't know why. Now, if you look at child abuse, child mistreatment, domestic violence for children, it basically decreased by 56 to 62%, depending on kind of abuse, over 20 years in the United States. It's same with violence against women. It's still the biggest cause of violence is domestic violence against women and children, but it is strongly on the decrease, no matter what. If you look at the number of casualties to any kind of conflict, civil war, ethnic, border conflict, interstate war, name it, massacres, etc. At the end of the Second World War, after the war, there was about 60,000 average victims per conflict. Now it's 1,000. Of course, you have Syria, you have Sudan, you have you know, the Iraq-Iran war, all these terrible things, but if you take all the conflicts throughout the world, and there are data banks doing that in Sweden and the US, it's vastly decreased. Of course, we know about it immediately thanks to the media, and it's good that we know. Still, all over the place, there's much less chance that we die today of violent death at war or through homicide than centuries ago. So this is a good sign. So, and it depends on what? A few factors. One is democracy. Now, there's hardly any chance that Belgium and Italy will go to war. Fully democratic country. Exchanges with others. You know, if you exchange with someone, he better be alive and in good health than dead. So you are interested that other countries prosperous if you do exchange with that country. Other factor is the status of women. It has been shown that the lower the status of women, the more violence in that country. That's clear. Also, how much a country is closed upon itself. So the worst is a non-democratic country closed upon itself, where the status of women is very low, education is low, and that's maximum risk of getting at war with another country or getting a civil war. So those factors are known. We can enhance them. So you see there's possibility to act on a personal level through mind training and all kinds of intervention. We can change our culture, look at the different attitude we have towards war. At the beginning of 19th century, war was something fantastic, you know, this how civilization grow, blah, blah, blah. It was heroic, beautiful. Now everybody thinks it's a terrible thing. And even there are still wars, nobody thinks war is great. So things can change. It takes little time, but things will change. So that's a hope. So let's work for it and we must work for the altruistic revolution and not be discouraged. So now, is also we can put compassion in action. So you mentioned the work you're doing here with CASA, with Conjuring Moshe Foundation, with the street animals and so forth, those who are abandoned. We do our little contribution in Asia, in Tibet, Nepal, and India to Karuna. Now we treat 100,000 patients a year in about 20 clinics that we built. This is one in Nepal. We have palliative care units. We build school with bamboos. This is a school built in 2 months entirely with bamboos for 2,000 children for about 150,000 euros. It's difficult to beat. So we build 9 schools like that. That makes about a little bit less than 20,000 children. In Tibet, we build dispensaries in very remote nomad areas. We also build bridges. Obviously, you need a bridge there somewhere. This is our car. This is a road, and this is the river. No, it starts. Driver is reciting his mantra very fast. So we built 18 bridges. One on the river in Tibet comes, in Asia comes from Tibet. So all the great Indochina and India do come from Tibet. And then we do home for the elderly. We do schools. This is a school at 4,000 meters high. We try to have as many girls as possible. We help in earthquake area for the victims. And this year we are building this spring an earthquake-resistant school at 4,000 meters high in eastern Tibet. And so this is just a few images from those beautiful places. You saw them in the slideshow in the beginning. That was last summer in Tibet. And then, my friend, Steve McCurry, you know the Afghan girl? You've seen the National Geographic? So 20 years later, he really wanted to find his Afghan girl. So he found the lady. She didn't look quite as beautiful as the little girl, but... So I thought, hey, I'm going to play a trick on him. He's my friend. So I'm going to find my Tibetan girl. So this I photographed her 10 years ago while doing one of our clinic projects. So this year I tried to find her. So I asked about her. And they said, oh, yeah, she's up there. I said, can you ask to come? I said, oh, it's about 2 days walk. So anyway, so finally I could see her. And here is she. Wait a minute. So, and she's called, because I didn't know her name first, she's called Beautiful Turquoise Ocean. And she goes to one of our schools there. So that she's the symbol of, you know, what we can try to dedicate. And she has also this kind of natural kindness that makes us sure that, yes, we can cultivate altruism. So thank you for your attention. So, if you want to go to rest, please don't hesitate. This is just extra. And I forgot my watch, so I have no idea what time is it. I'm sure I spoke too long. But if some of you want to stay a little bit, if you have to have some question, burning question, don't hesitate. We'll stay for a few more minutes together.
Temos agora a oportunidade para algumas perguntas que alguém possa querer fazer na sequência desta partilha, de facto fantástica, inspiradora e desafiadora, diria eu. Quisemos desde o princípio que fosse também um evento cúmplice e próximo. Não sei se alguém tem alguma pergunta.
Eu tenho uma pergunta a fazer.
Hello.
Aqui.
Okay.
Olá, boa noite. Eu posso falar em português?
Sim, sim, Mathieu Ricard tem tradução simultânea.
Yes, yes. I can hear.
Sim.
Faz favor.
Wonderful translator.
O meu nome é Jaime Silva, eu sou psicólogo e faço meditação há muitos anos. E para mim é uma honra poder ter assistido à sua palestra. Sou seu seguidor já há muitos anos pelos seus livros, pelas notícias que surgem na imprensa. Como psicólogo, uma das coisas que me preocupa na minha prática como psicoterapeuta é ver neste mundo selfie as pessoas cada vez mais desconectadas dos seus corpos. Portanto, a mente está muito envolvida com o tal me, eu, que Mathieu Ricard dizia, e os corpos completamente desconectados. Portanto, muita incapacidade, muita dificuldade em sentir, muita dificuldade em conectarem-se com o próprio corpo. A pergunta que eu gostava de fazer a um especialista em meditação era, ou o pedido, como é que nós poderemos, na nossa prática diária, na sua perspectiva, introduzir algum trabalho de meditação que seja suficientemente leve para não ser desmotivador, mas seja suficientemente poderoso para, passo a passo, produzir mudança e permitir que neste mundo selfie as pessoas comecem novamente a ligarem mente e corpo numa só unidade. Obrigado.
Oh, thank you. So I think your question was not entirely about mind-body, because how to do meditation in our world. I've been puzzled by this idea that we are not connected to our body. Sometimes I wish I was not connected to my body. I could fly and, lose my tummy because I have no body anymore, and climb mountains. It would be quite nice. Anyway, but I see what you mean. Yes. Actually, I remember my friend Ken Robinson is an educator. He says, academics are people who only think of their body as a way to move their head from one meeting to another. Anyway, so I'm not a specialist of body-mind, except when we do the clinical studies, which shows, of course, a big influence of mind training on the immune system, on inflammation, on the vagal tone. That's the way how you can calm yourself. So there's, of course, complete interaction between mind, body, and environment. The founder of Mind and Life, Francisco Varela, I was just in Chile on a conference dedicated to him. He spoke of this enaction, the consciousness exists in relation to the body and the environment, so it's all together. But now, just to go to your main question about what can we do in a busy life. First of all, 50 years ago, if you had told people, like big, busy, workers and CEOs, that they should spend 20 minutes 5 times a week to do physical exercise, they would say, no, what's the deal? I'm a CEO, or I don't have to have physical exercise to function better in my work. And now everybody knows that physical exercise is not only incredibly good for your health, but is even antidepressant. And there's so many advantages, longevity, immune system, name it, less cardiac problem, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. So now it's okay to say that you are going half an hour to the gym, and the people don't say, are you crazy or not? Why should you go to the gym? You have to work, because we know that the people will function better. So now the next step is that to bring in the culture the idea that if you take care, for 20 minutes of your mental immune system, it will have the same, even greater benefit in terms of human relations, having a vaster mind to take the right decision. And I have a French friend who just wrote a book. He interviewed 100 CEOs in the world that practice meditation. And they said, most of them, first they hesitated. Why should I do that? It's a waste of time. And also I might become less efficient. And when they try, they all say that they have a better judgment, they have much better human relation, and therefore everything works better. So the idea is that if it improves your life 23 hours of the rest of the time, even your sleep, seems to be a good investment. And then a few days ago in Paris, I was with another friend. It's called Ched Meng. He's a Google guy. And he wrote a book called Search Inside Yourself. It was a huge bestseller. So he's called the Jolly Fellow at Google. That's on his visiting card. And nobody contested. So he was one of the first 100 employees. So he's a millionaire and doesn't have anything to do except doing nice things at Google. So his idea was to bring caring mindfulness meditation everywhere in the world through Google in the offices, and he has this program called Search Inside Yourself. He's a very funny guy and nice and good heart. So, and his book has been very successful. But so once we were with the Dalai Lama, with Richard Davidson at Madison, and he spoke how he does it. And he said, for instance, he will do the 10-second meditation every hour, 10 seconds on loving kindness. And he says, you know, who says they cannot have 10 seconds? So actually, when we heard that, we sort of, oh, you know, he's really exaggerating. You know, this is crazy. You know, how can he say 10 seconds? Talk to the Dalai Lama, who meditates 4 hours every day for the last 60 years. And you tell the Dalai Lama, someone should meditate 10 seconds every year, every hour. But you know, after that, first of all, he got wonderful results, actually, with the Google people. But then we all thought about it, and this is much more profound than it sounds. First of all, because you cannot say you don't have 10 seconds every year, every hour. And then what do you do during those 10 seconds? It is a loving kindness for 10 seconds. So you look around every hour, and whoever is there, you know, through the window or in your office or here around you, and you don't jump at people's, you know, hugging them and kissing them and say, I love you and all that. That's not going to work. You might get a slap or whatever. So you just don't do anything. But you think from your heart, may these people be happy. May they be free from suffering. May their aspiration will be fulfilled. May they be safe. 10 seconds, that's all. So what does it do? Well, imagine that you opened a bottle of perfume. Well, that was my commentary on these 10 seconds. And then the perfume goes. You close the bottle after 10 seconds. Well, the perfume will still be there for quite a while. 5, 10 minutes. If you keep on opening 10 seconds the bottle of perfume, maybe there's perfume all day long. So the idea is you do something repeatedly. If you just do once a day, then you forget. But every hour, not 24 hours, but at least 6 times a day, 10 seconds, it creates some kind of, a stream. Something gets in motion so that actually this 10 seconds and the former 10 seconds are not completely disconnected. So there's something running, like water under the grass. And somehow it changes your attitude. Because you cannot wish, may everybody be happy, and then go against someone and slap them in the face. It doesn't work. So there's something so this is actually quite deep, because it's very wonderfully adapted to our kind of life. So these kind of things, and traditionally in meditation, we say it's better to do short, repeated meditation than a big one from time to time. So it's like this plant, a little water every day. If you just put 1 bucket every month, in the meantime it's dead. So a little bit, many, many times, and then something moves. So that's the way to do it in our busy life.
Thank you. Muito obrigado pela pergunta e pelos esclarecimentos, naturalmente. Mais alguma pergunta?
Yeah. Tachidele Matula. It's 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, I arrived to Bodh Gaya, and you were very kind to introduce me to Gelug Khyentse Rinpoche and translate my silly questions and translate the teachings of His Holiness. Now, fast forward, a few days ago, I've seen the recording of a therapy of a psychologist with an abused child. At some point, the child would say, to explain why she was hurting is her brother and other people and animals. And she would say, when I hurt them, I'm hurting myself. This, I think, it was the beginning of the healing process, and it was even kind of wisdom that was coming out of her mouth. So what I'm up to is the idea of of a positive selfishness. Because when one understands that there is no separation with the environment and there is no separation with other people, then you have a solid base to become altruistic, because that is your interest. But just to remind people to be nice and compassionate, I'm afraid that once we are in the merry-go-round of life and professional activities, that is going to be forgotten. And besides that, there is another question.
My problem is that the loudspeakers are facing the crowd, so you hear very well, I don't. So, did you get it?
Well, I try my best.
No, sorry. It's just it's always like that on stage. You don't hear because the loudspeaker goes to the public. Once I was with His Holiness Dalai Lama, and everybody could hear very well. I was 3 meters away. I could not hear anything he was saying. So, is it the fact that you said that when you hurt someone, it hurts yourself, so that makes you be altruistic because it hurts yourself? Those sort of enlightened selfishness? That's what you said?
As I understand, that is kind of wisdom realization. And
what? Yes?
I realize it is a sort of wisdom realization, and that sounds to me like a solid base to become really altruistic, because that is our own interest. Otherwise, in the merry-go-round of life and professional activities, you'll get lost.
Very clear now.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, His Holiness says often that the altruistic is the most clever selfish person. Because he says if you help someone, half of the time they're not happy about that. They might think, oh, what's this guy? Is maybe some hidden agenda. Or if you smile to someone, they say, why is he smiling to me? So he said it's not guaranteed that by being altruistic you'll really help someone. But he said the good thing is 100% sure you're going to help yourself, because there's this warm glow. So of course His Holiness doesn't mean that he sides with those psychologists who said we are 100% selfish, always interested. He's just kind of teasing us. But he's also teasing us, not only teasing us, but saying what I said in the beginning, that to be altruistic is the best way to fulfill both others' happiness and your own. Now, but you must be careful about that. Again, if your goal is selfish, this will not happen. You will be miserable, make others miserable. So, in order for both to work, you have to be genuinely altruistic. Then, and then only, your own satisfaction, gratification, warm glow will come as a bonus on top of it, as a secondary effect. Your goal is to bring some love, bring some help, do something, and then on top of that you get your own sort of fulfillment. It's like if you grow a field of wheat to feed your family, to feed the village, you also get the straw, the hay. You didn't do the whole work just to get that, but the hay can be useful. You can cover your roof with that or give to the cattle. So you just get extra. So then you may also think, when I'm with hatred, with anger, I'm hurting others, I'm hurting myself. So that's true. So therefore you think this is really a lose-lose situation. While if I'm kind to others, it's a win-win situation. So of course, reason and wisdom can help. But basically, the main thing to eventually you need to find out is that this whole sort of virtuous spiral will only happen if initially your motivation is genuinely altruistic and is not just like interested calculation. Because that maybe will teach you a little bit about altruism and inspire you to do more, but it will not bring this real fulfillment. You have to be genuine and sincere and earnest, then you just feel good. Even nobody knows about it, you still feel good.
Thank you. Mais alguma pergunta? Está ali uma pessoa?
Sou.
Está aqui à frente.
Boa noite. O meu nome é Bruno Roseiro, estou aqui deste lado.
Deste lado. Obrigado. Força.
Bruno Roseiro, sou educador de infância num lar de acolhimento de uma instituição nacional, acolhimento de crianças e jovens, e a minha preocupação, o que me tem preocupado nos últimos tempos, realmente é o lidar com uma população que por vezes parece que percebe mais a linguagem da zanga, do castigo, da punição, porque é essa a cultura que traz consigo, muitas das vezes. Nem sempre assim acontece, mas muitas das vezes é assim. E esta realidade é uma realidade que está sempre a mudar dia a dia, tem milhentas rotinas. A vida destas crianças é uma lufa-lufa, é uma azáfama constante. Acordar às 6h30 e ter todas as rotinas normais que à partida numa família haverá, e muitas mais outras, multiplicando por 15, 16 crianças e jovens que estão naquela casa. E vejo-me muitas vezes com grande dificuldade em chegar a uma individualidade no trato com uma criança específica, em que estou a dizer-lhes: boa, eu fiz isto contigo, fantástico, durou 5 segundos. E passamos à outra, a rotina que vem a seguir. E isto é quando eu consigo um bom momento, porque depois já as causas que estas crianças, aos efeitos que estas crianças revelam pelas causas pelo qual estão ali, que saem com a violência, com a agressão, com a tristeza, com o choro, por aí fora. E, portanto, nestes muitos 5 segundos que eu vou tendo com elas e nestes muitos conflitos e até coisas muito boas que vão acontecendo, realmente a minha dificuldade em conseguir olhar para dentro, não, eu tenho que me acalmar, eu tenho que concentrar-me, eu tenho que ter momentos em que posso chegar à meditação com o grupo, ou individual, ou eu mesmo, mas realmente não é fácil. À medida que ouvi a primeira resposta, eu pensei, eu vou pôr a pergunta, mas a parte já está respondida. Mesmo assim, é difícil, nesta azáfama, como é que eu consigo dar o que me pedem, quando realmente nisto tudo é difícil discernir e ter a tranquilidade necessária.
Is it for education? Is it a school? Oh. So, well, no, it's a whole subject, as you can imagine. Basically, you know, when I was doing this research on altruism, I just came out with something like, I don't know, almost 900-page book on the subject. I worked for 5 years, and of course I was very concerned about the question of education. And first of all, punishment, you know, this has been shown again and again, doesn't work, of course. If you punish someone, you know, how can he be happy, and then how can he cooperate and all that? But there's So now punishment is a bit less and less in Western culture, but there is still the competitive aspect. And that's also turned out not to be very productive. So first of all, we need what we call cooperative education. And that has been studied, that has been shown to work in hundreds of schools. It's still a minority, but it's very efficient in bringing better quality, emotional quality, and even better results and better relation among the children and with the teacher. So for instance, there's many ways of doing that. One way is you break a class in groups of 5 or 6, and you put better students with less good students, and then they have a lesson to learn. They split the lesson in 5 parts, each learn a small part, and then they get their knowledge together, and then they discuss, and so it works like that. And it's not who is going to be first, who is going to be last, but it's a teamwork. So that has been shown to be very productive and even better result. Another approach is called the value-based education. That's developed, for instance, by Neil Hawkes in the UK. And now, after 30 years, 10% of all schools in the UK are value-based education. So they do things like choosing the value of the month, like say, respect of others. So they write respect everywhere on the wall, in the kitchen. Everyone gets trained from the principal to the cooks and the students and the teacher. And then everything is about respect. So now, how in history, in geography, in this and that, how respect has importance, how it plays. So all these things happen. So even the teacher who thought this is all crazy and all that, now they all came through. And this was done in a very difficult area near Cambridge, very poor. And the school got 30% higher result than the rest of England. But more than anything, it gives kids which are extremely pro-social, forthcoming, very good relation to the teachers. The teachers stay in the school. Nobody leaves the school because it's such a good place to be. Then they did that in Australia with 100,000 children evaluated after 10 years and this remarkable result. So there are many such initiatives, or like the one Rishi Davidson is doing on mindfulness and loving kindness. At Emory University in Atlanta, they are doing a compassion-based intervention in children with very difficult, foster care children and all that. So all those interventions based on some mindfulness, some values, because to say that you have a neutral education is completely stupid, because education is never neutral, and if you don't put universal values like respect, contentment, patience, kindness, and all those, trust, fairness, and who can contest that those are universal? That doesn't make sense. Then the children will get values anyway, but they will get that to the worst of the worst, playing violent video games and stuff like that, which we know increase aggressivity and other immediately and in the long term. So there are plenty of those initiatives, and so the thing is how to bring them at a bigger scale. So in UK, they're quite successful. Australia also, there's also the positive education promoted by Martin Seligman. They gave him a whole huge schools to do, and there's also a very good result. So there are many initiatives in the world, and I think it's good to know about them. So maybe you can have a look at this called value-based education in UK, and there are books about that, manuals. So there's many ways we can do, for ourselves as an individual. If we are a little bit more, training through meditation, then we can have more inner strength, inner courage, less burnout, which is emotional exhaustion. So if you are, sorry, if you're less exhausted emotionally yourself, then you are more available, greater readiness to take care of others. So remember that whether it's in the medical field or in the professional field or education field, there's only empathy fatigue. There's no kindness fatigue. If it's genuine kindness, you don't get tired of it. And speaking about getting tired, I think let's all go to bed. That will be the best we can do. So thank you so much and good night. I just want to thank all my friends from CASA, from Constantin Moshe Foundation. There's so many kind volunteers. There's almost as much as volunteers as you coming here. Very, very kind, and also the university will receive us, so anyone who made this possible, because this is all dedicated to such a good purpose. So thank you so much.